All right, I did send out an email that alerted you to the fact that I'm not going to have office hours today. I've been called out of town. In addition, Sunday's my birthday. I'm going to be in the next decade, so I'm hitting that next decade. So every 10 years, you know, we do something. Well, actually, I was doing it every 5 years. My wife would take me somewhere, so she took, when I turned 60, she took me to the Bob Dylan concert, and then when I was 65, she took me to see Joan Baez, which are all people that you've heard of Bob Dylan probably, but maybe not Joan Baez, but she was a girlfriend of Bob Dylan and a folk singer, et cetera. But then 70, no concerts, right? So I'll have to remember that one as the COVID decade. All right. So last time we were, talking about the Constitution, right? And that's one of the primary, the primary chapters in the book, chapter 12, because it's called the Constitution of Liberty, right? So, and what he says that what you're really trying to do, you're trying to limit the power of the temporary majority. Right? Again, if we sort of think back to the logic of what's going on with Hayek, information is decentralized. The best way to make use of decentralized information is for you guys to act according to your own plan as much as possible. The proper role of government then is to maximize the amount of your ability to act according to your own plan and to minimize the total amount of coercion. And the economic system that this works with is what? It's market capitalism, right? Central planning can't work. And he says the social order doesn't require any more than the spontaneous order of the market, okay? So what's going on is, I need a written document to limit the power of the temporary majority. And we're going to set out those general principles by which we govern ourselves. And that's what he's talking about here. He says that last time we concluded with the fact that the Constitution limits the power of the temporary majority based on what these generally accepted principles have been that's been accepted by our social order for a long period of time. Then he says that in a civilized society, all power rests upon the idea that it's not arbitrary. Right? That if we have a civilized society, what happens? Power rests on the understanding that it's not arbitrary. Right? And what does that tell you? That he says that it's an understanding that it's going to be exercised according to some general principles. Remember that we said that one of the key things that the founders were talking about was no arbitrary power. So he says that it's going to be, the power is going to be based on some general principles that we've agreed to. Right? That is, there's some, and if you sort of think about, how the world would work, is that, yeah, I'm not going to give you power unless I have some understanding about how that power is going to be used. Right? I'm not going to, it would be difficult for me to, or for a large group of people, to agree to a situation where, hey, we're just going to give over power to our governor and she can go out and do any old darn thing she wants. Okay? Or we're going to give power to our president, then that president can go out and just do executive orders and do whatever the heck they want. Right? It would be difficult for us to say, yeah, that's what we want to do. Right? So he says that power is not a physical fact, but a state of being. Right? right? It says that power is not a physical, sort of a physical state of the world, but it's a state of opinion which people obey. And remember that if we just go back to Mises's discussion about democracy and liberalism, and when Hayek's discussion about democracy, what is the point about democracy? It's right. It's you got to consent to the governed, so you don't have revolution all the time. Okay, we're going to have an election here in the next few days, and we're not going to go out and have an uprising, and some group is going to come along and storm the White House and take it over, etc. Right? So what's really going on is that this transfer of power is going to occur because people accept that, okay, this whoever's in charge isn't going to be able to do any old darn thing they want. Right? If whoever was in charge could do anything, could decide it's going to chop the arms and legs off of a whole bunch of us, and then we'd say, okay, hey, I'm not likely to just go ahead and get along with that, right? So, this is very similar to, again, what Mises was saying about why you have democracy, and the issue was democracy. He says that all governments have to retain the support of the people, right? When he's talking, that was what Mises was talking about. Similar idea here that ultimately the power that government has is that we have agreed to accept that power, and our intuition or our belief is that this is going to be bounded by some general principles. So he says that, this is where he says the U.S. Constitution is then a constitution of liberty, right? This is the title of the book. This is where he says U.S. Constitution is a constitution of liberty. What are we writing in our Constitution, right? Why do we put stuff in the Constitution? We put stuff in the Constitution because what's it going to do? It's going to maximize the ability of to act according to your own plan, to maximize that sphere of free action that we were talking about, and he talked about in Chapter 10. And then again, it's to protect the individual against arbitrary coercion, right? We're trying to minimize that total amount of coercion. So the purpose of the Constitution is to protect the individual against arbitrary coercion, right? Again, it's not like we don't want to have any government, right? You need a government to protect property rights. We talk, Mises says, liberals are not anarchists. Bastiat says the government, why do we have government? It's part of our natural right to self-defense, etc. And so this is very consistent with what the other authors talked about. Then he goes, he says, well, we didn't have a constitution when we started, right? We started with the Articles of Confederation. So why did we get rid of that, right? You had the Articles of Confederation. And again, I'm presuming you all either took or will take a class in, it's probably, is Politics 101, do they talk about Articles of Confederation? Yeah. Okay. So what's the deal? You start out with this Articles of Confederation, and then we get rid of it, right? And we have a Constitutional Convention, and we create a Constitution, something that's different than what the Articles of Confederation were about. And so what is the issue? One of the problems with the Articles of Confederation is that the states themselves could be coercive, right? So if we think of two problems here with the Articles, one is, if you sort of think about it, the states themselves could be coercive, right? There's nothing in the Articles of Confederation that limits the power of what the government can do in Massachusetts, or what it could do in the state of Michigan if it were around then, which it wasn't. There's this idea that the states themselves could be coercive in their power. And what does Hayek points out? Hayek says, just as an example, what's he talking about? He's talking about 6 states had a situation where the legislature could amend the Constitution, right? And we said that doesn't make sense. How can the legislature could amend the state constitution, and what's the problem there? We talked about it doesn't make sense for the legislature to be able to amend the Constitution, because how can it be binding, right? If the legislature is bound by the Constitution and it can't do what it wants to do, the legislature just amend the Constitution to make it so that they could do that. And in several states, he says in several states that they just simply ignored it, right? They simply ignored the state constitution, right? So he says several states, they just ignored the Constitution. So that was one problem, right? That is, the Articles of Confederation said, let's states, we're just going to get together and we're going to agree on these articles, but it doesn't limit the total amount of coercion, in the sense that you could be living in a state where your state legislator or your state executive branch is coercive, and it would be difficult to get around that. He says the second problem was that they didn't really create a central government with the authority to raise an army. That was a big deal, right? Again, if you've read the Federalist Papers, that's an important issue, right? It didn't create a federal or national government with the power to raise an army. And of course, this is an issue, right? Because what do? We just had a revolution where we separated ourselves from Great Britain. But then what happens? In 1815, right? Anybody know what happens in 1812, around there? We get in a fight with them, right? Yeah, the War of 1812, right? So this wasn't something that was just like, oh, well, maybe there's a slight chance it's going to happen, right? We're fighting them again in 1812. So this issue of defense, is somebody going to invade us? Maybe is France going to invade us? Is England going to invade us? Who might invade us? That was a real issue in those days. So again, the question is, you're just relying on the other states to come and help you out, right? Florida, let's say Spain decides to take Florida back. So then what might happen? Well, the Spanish Armada shows up, and you're living up there in Massachusetts, and you go, you know what? Hey, maybe the Marlins will show up one day, and I'm not going to send a bunch of people down there to deal with this, right? So the question is, would the states come to the aid of other states? Because you don't have a federal army, right? You're relying on the militia. That again, if Florida is attacked by Spain, you're relying that, oh yeah, what's going to happen is the militia from Massachusetts or the militia from someplace else will go ahead and show up and will help them out. Now, how did you fix that, right? So Madison comes along and says, you know what? How about we have a federalist system, right? Right, a federalist system as a solution. That is, if we create a government we're going to have this government's going to have enough power to defend ourselves, right? It's going to be able to raise an army, and how's it going to get that? It's going to be able to tax us. How are we going to create that, this federalist system? What are you trying to do? You're trying to create a government powerful enough to what? Protect life, liberty, and property, right? Right? We're going to have, instead of the Articles of Confederation saying, hey, you know what? We're agreeing, we're writing down a piece of paper, we're going to agree that if any one of the states gets attacked by somebody else, we'll send our militia in to help. Right? In my law and economics class, talk about contracts and how do you enforce contracts and that kind of thing, right? How are you going to enforce that contract? If Massachusetts decides not to come help you, what do? While you're fighting the Spanish, do you try to go to court and sue Massachusetts for not sending their their militia down? Not going to work very well, right? So what Madison says is, how about we create a national government, and that national government is going to be powerful enough that it can defend this new government, the United States of America. We're going to defend this new government, and yet how can it not become coercive in itself? Right? How do we limit? Basically, how do you limit what this new entity, this new government can be? And what Madison thought about is, we'll have a division of power. Right? There's going to be a division of power. And what's Hayek point out? He says that a number of kinds of coercion, okay, we'll say coercion often requires that you have a joint and coordinated use of different powers, right? We have a joint and coordinated use of different powers, right? That is, if you keep these powers separate, then no one person can exercise power. Okay? Notice that if this were 1265, right? What was the king limited by? The king was limited by divine law or etc. Right? But basically, the king had pretty wide coercive powers because they were the legislative authority and the executive authority and the judicial authority all rolled into one. Okay? But the idea here is to Hayek pointing out that oftentimes when you have coercion, you need to have all these different kinds of powers in one location. And if what you do is if you say, okay, here's some powers that we're going to grant here, and you don't get all these other powers, then it's less likely that this federal government is going to be coercive. So notice that what happens if a state becomes coercive? Right? Let's say the state of Michigan, you're not really happy with the court. It has coercive powers. The governor's doing this, or the legislative body's becoming coercive. It's charging you high taxes and forcing you to do this. Closing down your businesses or whatever. You can always leave a state. You can leave a state that becomes coercive. Right? If California, in fact, what are we noticing in California? That if they have very high tax rates and they have the legislature starting to do all sorts of interventionist things, right? What does Mises say about interventionism? Causes unintended consequences, leading to further government intervention, more unintended consequences, more further government intervention, et cetera, right? So if California's doing that and it's got high tax rates, what will happen? People will move, right? They will move to Oregon, right? How many people are from Oregon? Wow, not too many, okay? But the makeup of Oregon population looks very different than it did 50 years ago, right? Or 40 years ago, okay? And what happened was that people are moving from California to there, people moving from California to Texas, et cetera. So actually sort of interesting. You can look at rates for U-Haul trucks moving from one state to another, right? There are mechanisms that you can look at to look at what the outflow and inflow is from the different states. Anyway, you know, someday maybe you might, you know, if you have to write a paper for a class or whatever, you know, that's one of the things that you can look at is so you can get data on movements across state lines. So, but anyway, Hayek's point here is that if you separate out the powers, right, if you have states have certain powers, federal government's got certain powers, then if a state government becomes too coercive, you have a mechanism to move to someplace else. If you didn't separate out the states, if you only had the federal government, right, and you didn't have state governments that have powers different or separate from what the federal government can do, then that mechanism wouldn't be available. Then Hayek has an interesting discussion of the Bill of Rights here. And if you sort of, again, if you think back to, you know, if you've had the Politics 101 class, what did Hamilton say? Hamilton said, you know what, we really don't need a Bill of Rights, and it's going to cause a problem. Hamilton said a Bill of Rights is going to cause a problem. And if you sort of think about it, what would be that problem? That is, there's no need to include what our rights are and there's no need to include what our rights are since the powers to restrict those rights were never explicitly granted, aren't explicitly granted to the federal government in the Constitution, right? That is, to include our rights, because the power to interfere in those rights are not explicitly granted. Right? To the federal government in the Constitution. So why are we putting it in there, right? It doesn't say that the federal government can interfere with free speech. It doesn't have that power to do that. And if I put it in there, will people think these are the only rights? Right? I start listing, you have the right to peaceable assembly, right? Where does it say in the Constitution that the federal government can keep you from assembling, right? Where does it, and if I start listing these things out, why in the heck am I putting in there? Why am I listing them if there's all sorts of other rights? Right? People are going to think, okay, they listed these 10 rights or these 15 rights, and that, you know, those must be the rights that you have, or they're you know, and so that would create a problem. And so so what he says is that if you have this problem here, then if I include in the Bill of Rights, what I'm acting like there's more powers than there otherwise are, right? Why am I saying that you can't do this when I never said that you could do it. So does this result in implied powers? Right? That is, I must have had the. Why are you putting in that people have the right to peaceably assemble if the federal government didn't have an ability to keep you from peaceably assembling, right? Why would I stick that thing in there? So if we, you have both situations in here. Are there implied powers in the Constitution, and are the only rights that we have the things that we stuck in the Bill of Rights? So what happened? Notice that the Constitution gives some powers to the federal government, but we don't need to specifically limit this granted power. So what happens? As a compromise, right, as a compromise, what happened? You voted on the Constitution without the Bill of Rights, right? We went ahead and said, okay, we'll vote on this Constitution, and the Constitution was in fact ratified by the Constitutional Convention without a Bill of Rights in there. So when does the Bill of Rights show up? Madison puts it in the first Congress, right? That was the solution to the problem, is that Madison offers the amendments to the Constitution. In the first Congress. And there were actually 12 amendments that were put in. 10 of them got ratified. Actually, the 12th one ended up being ratified in 1992. So just sort of an interesting thing to look through the amendments and see that. But nonetheless, the 10 that we're concerned about, or that we're talking about here, is that what happens with the first 8 amendments? The first 8 amendments guarantee some freedoms, right? Or rights, we'll say. They guarantee some rights. Right? So the first 8 amendments are about there guaranteeing some rights that we have. And then what happens is the 9th Amendment, you know, what does the 9th Amendment talk about, right? The 9th Amendment says that the enumeration of these rights doesn't disparage the other rights that are not enumerated, right? So, if you know, what does the 9th Amendment say? The 9th Amendment says these are not our only rights, right? So it addresses, right, Hamilton's concern. Are these our only rights? Right? So the 9th Amendment says, putting these rights in doesn't disparage the other rights that we have sitting out there. Okay? There was, I don't know if you ever heard of this court case. There's a semi-famous court case called Roe versus Wade. And it sort of came up when the discussion about the latest Supreme Court nominee who's appointed to the Supreme Court. Okay? And what was that? Anybody know what that was decided on? The right to what? Yeah, the right to privacy. It's not sitting there, right? You know, we don't see privacy listed there. What was that? That's one of those non-enumerated rights. Okay? So, so the 9th Amendment there was to address Hamilton's concern. And then the 10th Amendment says what? That the powers not specifically delegated by this Constitution to the federal government are retained by the states or the people respectively. Right? So the 10th Amendment what does it talk about? The 10th Amendment says there are no non-enumerated powers. Right? The 10th Amendment says that the powers not specifically delegated by the U.S. Constitution nor prohibited by it, prohibited by the Constitution of the states are retained by the states or retained by the states or the people. So that if there's something in the Constitution that says, hey, states can't do this, right, then we know that. But we know that the states have all the other powers, okay? You know, the state may limit within its own constitution what it can do, but the federal government says, you know what, here's enumerated powers that the federal government has, and all the other powers, unless specifically prohibited to give to the states. It may say the states can't preclude you from doing X, Y, or Z, right? But if it's not that power is not specifically prohibited by it to the states, those things are retained by the states and the people respectively. Okay. All right. Now think about how powerful that thing has been in keeping the federal government from using non-enumerated powers, right? You know, what is that that you know, you really, if you were to have if the federal government's doing something, you really need to be able to go through and say, okay, this power was granted to the federal government by somewhere in the Constitution, okay? People, if you listen to the average person discussing the powers of the federal government, even if they're just discussing it sort of on a theoretical basis, they don't usually discuss it in terms of the 10th Amendment. I mean, think of how many times the 10th Amendment, you know, a discussion of the 10th Amendment comes up when you're listening to Fox News or you're listening to CNBC or whatever, right? It doesn't really come up. Think about, I mean, even the debate between the presidential candidates. I didn't manage to watch the entire debates, but I'm going to guess that you didn't hear anything about the 10th Amendment anybody hear anything about the 10th Amendment in those debates? Right. So, you know, it's important to, again, you know, why talk about, you know, why have essay questions here in the exams here, is to get it so that you can point this out to other people, right? You have a mechanism to say, hey, you know what, you know, I don't think that this is the proper role of government for these, you know, economic reasons perhaps, but also where, you know, tell me in the, you know, ask the person, tell me where this enumerated power is in the Constitution. Can they show that to me? And I will bet you they've never, probably a large number of them never heard of the 10th Amendment. But if they did, I think it would be difficult for them to point out what that is. Now, so Madison, yes?
I was just going to ask, if you would reply with like necessary proper clause, like Article 2.
Yes, you could. Yes, you could talk about the necessary and proper clause, and so you have to. So that has been sort of a, in a sense, a gate opener, and you would have to. But it would be necessary for that person to then argue why this is necessary for this to happen, right? So you might narrow what they have to show in order to, you know, you at least can say, here's what you have to show me in order to say that this is a power that the federal government's got. You're going to show me why this is necessary for the federal government to accomplish the other powers, right? It can't just be, well, it's necessary for them to do whatever the heck they want, right? It's necessary for them to do the powers that have been granted to them, right? An interesting controversy that exists is for people who, you know, might be classical liberals or believe in limited government. What about the 9th Amendment? if you look at the Hayek and others, they believe the Ninth Amendment is an important limitation on the power of the executive and legislative branch. Okay? If you're looking at Hayek, Hayek thinks that this is an important limitation on the legislative and executive branch. Right? That a Ninth Amendment says, hey, we got lots of rights out there that you can't be intruding on. And if the president's trying to do it by executive order, or the Congress is trying to do that, you could take them to court and you could use the Ninth Amendment to say, no, you're violating a right that I have that's not enumerated. And so that would limit what the Congress and what the executive branch could do. Why would they be concerned about that? Is that the federal government, if you think about where the powers that you have to worry about, is that they think the executive and legislative branch, they're the most feared branch of government. The most feared branches of government. And so what we want to do is we want to limit, what does this allow to do? It allows the judicial branch to limit what the executive and legislative body can do, right? You can go to the Supreme Court and they can say, no, sorry, you intruded on this right here that is a non-enumerated right. And in Federalist 78, what does Hamilton say about, right? Hamilton says the judicial branch is the least to be feared. Right? In Federalist 78, Hamilton's saying, hey, you know what? Judicial branch is that branch of government that we can fear the least about intruding on our rights. Notice who also talked about that. Bastiat. Right? Remember we said that Bastiat said, have you ever heard of someone going to the Court of Appeals to engage in legalized plunder? Right? Like, hey, that couldn't happen. Right? That doesn't happen. So if we look back, Bastiat, 1850, Federalist 78, and Hayek in 1960. What is he? Those folks tend to believe that the Ninth Amendment is an important limitation on that executive and the judicial branch. Now, if you look at some limited government believers, right? If we say, I don't know how to put it other than limited government believers, but people who believe in it. If you look at Bork and Scalia, right? Bork was, he wrote Robert Bork, he wrote a book about this, but Robert Bork thinks that and remember he was nominated for the Supreme Court position, but at the time Ted Kennedy was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he didn't get nominated, or didn't get appointed. And Anthony Scalia actually ended up on the Supreme Court, right? So both of these folks, Bork's book's called The Tempting of America. It's actually a very nice, very good book to read if you ever get a chance over the summer or something. It's a little lengthy, but it's an interesting book to read. But what are they saying? Their problem is that the Ninth Amendment, what's that going to do? It's going to result in judicial activism. And this will lead to greater coercion. That is, if you look at what your government, what your federal government can do, suppose that we find the judicial branch finds a right to health care, right? It says, hey, that's one of the non-enumerated rights, right? Just as an example, what if the judicial branch, you sue, right? You know, you're here in Michigan and you lose your job and you don't have health insurance, and what you do is you sue and you say, you know what, there's a fundamental right to health care that is not put into the Constitution, but it's one of those non-enumerated rights. And so what could happen? The judicial branch could find rights and then require the legislative or executive branch to provide these. Say, okay, no, there's going to be a Medicare for all, right? And you're going to have to, the executive branch, judicial branch, you're going to have to produce that. Yeah.
But isn't the Ninth Amendment saying that there are other rights that the government cannot interfere in, not there are other rights that the government must provide for?
Right. So it's the rights that you can't interfere with, but it might say, hey, you have to provide these rights, and that's what Bork and Scalia are concerned about. They think that what's going to happen is that you're going to, and again, that's a very good point. One of the issues is, does the government just have to defend, not intrude upon certain rights, or does it have to provide for certain rights? And that is, and that is a debate over what's going on in the Ninth Amendment. Because then if you say there's this right to health care, then what would happen is now that's requiring other people to pay taxes to provide that right, which is a different picture than what Hayek would be thinking about in the Ninth Amendment. But Bork and Scalia, that's their concern. Their concern is you're going to end up with an activist judiciary that's going to run around and start finding rights and then requiring the executive and judicial branch to provide for these rights. Yes?
But isn't Hamilton's argument in 78 when he calls it the weakest branch, that the judicial branch can't enforce any of their rulings? The executive and the legislative branch are under no obligation to follow what they say?
Yes, that's part of it. I guess what I'm trying to point out is that if we what I'm trying to point out here is that your view, and if you, there's a nice discussion on the Cato Institute has this nice website discussion about this debate between the two sides on the Ninth Amendment. You got conservatives on the one side saying, yeah, the Ninth Amendment is important to protect us against the executive and legislative branch doing stuff, and the folks on the other side, and they're saying, and that's less going to be less of a problem than because the judicial branch is, in a sense, the weakest of the branches to be able to do stuff, right? So in fact, I mean, that's pretty much very similar to what you just said, right? That the judicial branch is the weakest of the branches, and so again, Bastiat, very similar idea. So it really then comes down to who do you think is the branch that's most likely to be coercive. It wasn't until 1960 that you begin to get the activist judiciary under Richard Nixon's appointments. Earl Warren when he became Chief Justice. When Earl Warren became Chief Justice, you begin to see more government actions by the or judicial activism by the courts. But somebody over here had a question. No? Yes. And I'll get yours too. But yeah.
Does the Ninth Amendment provide any distinction between negative rights and positive rights?
Well, I mean that's what we were just talking about, right? I mean, is there a positive right being something that I can now enforce and make the executive branch and the judicial branch, or excuse me, executive and the legislative branches provide for me, that as opposed to they just can't intrude on it, right? So this is this issue of negative and positive rights, but that's basically what we're talking about here.
Yeah, my question is there any attempt within the Ninth Amendment to provide that distinction in any way, or does it just say that other rights exist?
No, it just, I mean, the Ninth Amendment doesn't, I mean, it just says, this doesn't, it says it doesn't, basically it doesn't disparage the other rights that we have out there, okay. Right? It just says, it doesn't disparage the rights that we have out there. And so how you interpret that, you go on for decades and you interpret it really narrowly, and then you get a situation where the judiciary becomes activist. And then you get the federal government finding, then you get the judicial branch becoming more and more saying, hey, this is a right that's not enumerated, so therefore executive and legislative branch, you got to do this. But yeah.
I guess my question would be like, where would judicial review fall into this? Because it seems like that makes this issue a little bit more complicated, because it seems to give the judiciary a lot more power than maybe it was originally intended to have.
Well, right. I mean, that brings us to the next point, is that where in the Constitution does it say that judicial branch can review legislative and executive action? And of course, it ain't there, right? Judicial review, when did we first talk about judicial review, is Marbury versus Madison, right? 1803, Chief Justice John Marshall, in Marbury versus Madison, that's when you get this idea of judicial review, right? It's not there, and you don't get a lot of overturning in the first, decades of the United States. You don't get a lot of these judicial review going on. But it's not something that is embedded in the Constitution. It's something that in Marbury versus Madison, Chief Justice Marshall just, he says that basically the court could void legislation as being unconstitutional. Again, the point here that I'm trying to make is that you got Hayek over here saying, hey, the Ninth Amendment is really important, right? And there's a bunch of folks that believe in limited government that say, hey, the Ninth Amendment is really important because it puts a bound on what the executive and legislative branches can do. Do you have Robert Bork in, again, his book Tempting of America? They come along, and now you've got these judicial scholars that are limited government folks, and they're arguing that the Ninth Amendment is going to grant too much power to the judicial branch. So it really just depends your view on the Ninth Amendment. And again, I said the Cato Institute has a number of articles that discuss this conflict between the folks that worry about judicial branch being the power you got to worry about, and the executive and legislative branch. So it really depends on what your view of which is the more likely to become coercive. If you are Hayekian, you're going to be happy with the Ninth Amendment. If you are Bork and Scalia, then you're going to think the Ninth Amendment is a problem and that we ought to ignore it. In fact, what we'll do for next time is we'll talk about, next time we'll finish chapter 12, and that will be what we're going to do for the exam. Okay. What we will then do is, so we'll finish chapter 12, I'll talk a little bit about progress in a Capitalist Manifesto. Again, the Capitalist Manifesto chapters, as we had in the syllabus, there's little chapters on Bastiat and Hayek, etc. So there's a little one called Progress that you might want to take a look at, and then we're going to do How the West Grew Rich. That will be the last thing that we read. Yeah. You know, I forgot to bring my album of the week, and I drove in and I was thinking, should I drive home and get it, or no, I might miss class. I got a 9 o'clock class. So, but I'll bring it in on Monday.